City, A Story of Roman Planning and Construction by David Macaulay. Part 2. This book is copyrighted and is for classroom use only. Page 44. Before the wall of the city was finished, work began on the streets. Verbonia's streets were designed for people. Therefore, adequate sidewalks were built and strict laws were written to control any movement of carts and chariots which could endanger the health and safety of people in the streets. During the day, all carts and chariots, except those carrying building materials, were banned from the streets. This meant that deliveries had to be made at night or in the early morning. Carts and horses were very noisy, so many of the streets on which people lived were made one-way or dead-end to reduce traffic. The sidewalks on both sides of the street were raised 1.5 feet above the road surface. This precaution prevented vehicles from accidentally rolling into the path of pedestrians. Stepping stones were embedded in the middle of the road to connect the sidewalks. Animals and carts could straddle the stones, but only if they went slowly. In this way, the stones helped to enforce the speed limit. When it rained, the streets were gutters through which the water ran into sewers under the sidewalks. The stepping stones enabled people to cross the street without getting their sandals drenched. The Cardo and Decumanus were finished first. Other streets were completed as the area around them developed. Page 46. In 20 BC, Appius and his staff started on the supply system that would distribute water throughout the city. The aqueduct was carried over the south wall and connected to 2 reservoirs. These were deep rectangular pools whose walls were brick-faced concrete, a wall of triangular bricks on the inside and outside enclosing layers of concrete. Every few feet of the top wall was covered with 3 courses of large, flat bricks. This allowed the contractor to adjust the level of the wall if it was not perfect. Each reservoir was covered by a concrete tunnel vault. The vaults were constructed over a semi-circular wooden form supported on scaffolding between the sides of the pool. Brick reinforcing arches were first constructed over the form 10 feet apart. The entire form was then lined with flat bricks and covered with a thick layer of concrete. When the concrete hardened and could stand by itself, the form was removed into the next position. Using the same form over and over, the process was repeated until the reservoir was covered. The brick facing on the inside surface of the vaults and walls was covered with hard cement. The outside of the vault was shaped like a pitched roof and covered with tiles. Page 47, Diagram of Tunnel Vault. Page 48. On the wall at one end of the reservoir were several gates channeling the water into lead pipes which ran either to public fountains, toilets, and baths, or to the homes of the wealthy. When there was a shortage of water, the gate leading to these homes was closed, and then, if necessary, the gate to the baths and toilets was closed as well. This ensured that the public fountains supplying the majority of Verbonia's residents would be the last to run dry. The water for wealthy homes was first piped into a lead tank placed on one of many high brick towers. As it ran back down other pipes, the water gained enough pressure to feed all the houses to which the tower was connected. Page 49. Diagram of Public Fountain. Page 50. In order for the water supply to be efficient, an equally efficient drainage system was required. Sewers originally constructed under the sidewalks for rainwater were enlarged. They were connected to both public and private buildings by clay pipes. Some of the sewers were 6 feet deep. They were all built of stone and mortar, and their tops were removable stone slabs in case repairs were necessary. The slabs were covered by compressed dirt in which the lead pipe supply pipes from the water towers were laid. All of the sewers were connected to 2 cloaca, sewers, tunnels large enough to walk in, which carried the water under the walls of the city and down to the river. Iron grills were installed inside them, which let the water out but prevented anyone from getting in. By 19 BC, the city walls were finished and work began on the first and most important public areas of the city, the Forum and the Market. Page 54. The Forum was paved and covered 2 entire blocks. At one end of the temple of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva was built. Of all the temples to be built in the Forum, this was the most important. At the opposite end, facing the temple, was the rostrum. This was a raised platform from which speeches were made and decrees were read to the residents of the city. Along one side of the Forum stood the Curia, the building in which the elected senators of the city met. Next to the Curia was the Basilica, the court of justice, The temple was constructed of polished limestone, while the other two buildings were brick-faced concrete covered with sheets of limestone. All the roofs were made of triangular wooden frames called trusses, covered by rows of clay tile. Page 55, Diagram of Temple of Jupiter. The buildings in the Forum were surrounded by rows of columns called colonnades. The columns were either built of cylindrical stone blocks set on top of each other, or they were constructed of brick and mortar covered by cement. A long two-story structure enclosed on both sides by colonnades was built to separate the Forum from the busy streets. On the lower level were little shops which faced the streets. On the second level were offices and schoolrooms which faced the Forum. Page 58. Over the main entrance to the Forum, off the Cardo, a large triumphal arch was constructed to the glory of the emperor. It was made of brick-faced concrete and covered with sheets of colored marble. On special holidays, processions would enter the Forum through the arch. Page 59, the Central Market. Because new temples were always being enlarged or replaced, the Forum really wasn't finished for 200 years. But the Central Market across the street was finished in less than 5. This was not surprising, since Verbonia's main function was that of a trading center. The open area in which farmers and merchants set up their stands covered almost half a block and was surrounded on all 4 sides by colonnades similar to those in the Forum. In the center was a public fountain and a shrine to Ceres, the goddess of agriculture. Page 60. Diagram of Central Market. Page 61. Many of the offices on the second level were rented by businessmen who kept similar offices in other cities, including Rome. These men brought much of the produce from the fields around the city and shipped it to markets all over the empire. Warehouses for storing grain, wine, and oil were built along the streets close to the market. The wine and oil were stored in large clay pots called amphora, buried in the ground, which kept them cool. To prevent moisture from damaging the grain crop, it was stored on a floor supported 2 feet above the lower floor by brick piers. Ventilation holes in the raised floor let air move freely around the sacks of grain. Some of the larger warehouses contained many storerooms located around an open courtyard. Since much of the crop was transported by boat, a dock and some warehouses were constructed along the riverbank. At first, everyone shopped in the Central Market, but as the population increased, the market, in spite of its size, became too small. In anticipation of this, the planners had set aside areas on the master plan for future markets. Although they looked very similar, one market specialized in fruits and vegetables, another in grain, and a third, near the north gate and closest to the river, sold only fish. Page 64. Along the streets that connected the markets, shops and workshops were built side by side. On one street, Marcus Licinius, who came from Rome, built a bakery. Bread was one of the most important foods for the people of Verbonia, and many bakeries were built throughout the city. The main ingredient in bread was flour, which was obtained by grinding grain in stone mills. Each mill consisted of 2 main pieces. The outer piece was rotated around the inner piece by pushing on the projecting arms. The grain was crushed or milled as it passed through the narrow spaces between the two. The flour that came out at the bottom of the mill was mixed with water and made into dough. Salt and leaven were then added. The dough was kneaded and formed into a flat circular loaf and baked in a large brick oven. Page 65. Diagram of a bakery. Page 66. The house of Marcus Licinius. The contractor who bought Marcus's bakery also built his house. Like those of his neighbor, Marcus's house was quite large. The exterior walls were brick-faced concrete. Some of the interior walls were the same, while others were vertical wooden frames filled with small stones and mortar. All the walls were covered with a thick coat of plaster called stucco and painted. There were many areas shown on the plan, but 2 were much larger than the others. The first, at the front of the house, was called the atrium, and it was connected to the sidewalk by a narrow passage. The second, in the rear of the house, was a garden surrounded by a colonnade. This area is called the peristyle. The dining room, library, kitchen, and storerooms were located around the atrium, while the bedrooms and servant quarters were on the second level. Most of the activities took place in the atrium because of its size, and the light that came through a square opening in the roof. Under the opening, called a compluvium, a shallow pool called an impluvium was sunk into the floor. Rain which fell into the impluvium ran through a small hole and into an underground tank. The water was needed, the cover was taken off the tank, and a clay jug lowered into it. Marcus's favorite part of the house was the peristyle. It was quiet and private and very relaxing after a few hours in the bakery. It contained a fountain, which could be turned off and on by a faucet. It also contained a shrine to the Lares, the god who protected Marcus's house. The floor of the atrium and peristyle were covered with mosaic, small black and white marble tiles that were pressed into wet cement in a variety of geometric patterns. Because one house was built right up against another, the only windows were located at the front facing the street. These were usually very small and covered with bars for security. To brighten up the small dark rooms, colorful pictures were painted on the walls. Many rooms contained jungle scenes full of wild animals and exotic plants. Imitation windows were painted in other rooms to make them seem less confining. In the winter, the important rooms were heated by wood stoves. On one side of the passage between the sidewalk and the atrium, a toilet was connected to the sewer pipe and flushed by a continuous stream of water. On the other side, a room that opened into the sidewalk was rented out to a jeweler named Lucius Julius, who knew what a jewelry shop in Marcus's neighborhood would be very profitable. Page 71, the front view of Marcus Licinius's house. Page 72. Lucius was a former slave who had learned his craft in Egypt and had taken the name of the man who bought him and eventually freed him. He and his family lived in an apartment in another section of the city. Both the interior and exterior walls of this building were constructed of heavy timber framework, filled with stone and mortar and covered with stucco. Instead of an atrium, the apartment building contained a small courtyard above which was the high open space. It was called a light shaft because it supplied the only natural light for the small inner rooms. Page 72, diagram of Lucius's apartment. Page 74. The few rooms of Lucius's apartment were quite small, and the same one was often used for many purposes. The largest of the rooms opened onto a balcony overlooking the street. On the ground floor of the building was a shop that sold olive oil. Besides amphora buried in the ground for storing the oil, the shop contained a press for squeezing the oil out of the olives. Page 75, diagram of olive oil shop. Page 76. Some of the apartment buildings had small wells, but few contained toilets. Most of the residents used the public toilets located around the city. All the buildings in Lucius's neighborhood contained 2 or more apartments. Many were owned by Marcus Licinius's neighbors, and all contained shops opening onto the sidewalk. One of those shops was rented by a barber named Quintus Aurelius. The success of Quintus's business was mostly due to his willingness to gossip. For spreading news, Quintus and Verbonia's other barbers were almost always as important as the government decrees read in the forum, and they were definitely faster. Page 78. By the time of Augustus's death in AD 14, the streets of Verbonia were lined with grocery shops, pastry shops, ceramic shops, furniture shops, clothing shops, drugstores, wine shops, and snack bars. Many of the craftsmen on a particular street often specialized in the same or related crafts. Most of the shops along a small, quiet street near the Forum were owned by a highly skilled gold workers, and the street eventually became known as the Street of Gold. The craftsmen and their family lived in rooms behind or above their shops. As neighborhoods developed, families often got together to build shrines on their streets dedicated to the Lares. Page 80, diagram of a snack bar. Most of the snack bars were owned by Servius Vitellius, who also owned a chain of snack bars in Ariminum. The snack bars opened into the sidewalk, and each contained a concrete serving counter decorated with pieces of colored marble. Clay jugs embedded in the counter contained hot and cold drinks to be sold. A row of clay drinking cups marked with Servius's name stood on a marble shelf next to the counter. At night, and during the hot afternoons, all the shops could be closed by fitting wooden panels into grooves on the tops and bottoms of the doorways. A lock was used to secure them in place. At night, the city provided torch-carrying watchmen who patrolled the streets, checking the locks and doors of all the buildings. Page 82. Upon his death, Augustus became a god, and the Emperor Tiberius, who succeeded him, ordered the building of temples in Augustus's honor throughout the empire. As usual, the citizens of each city, not the emperor, paid for these temples. The wealthy of Verbonia managed to take advantage of the situation by either renting some of their slaves to the contractor building the temple, or by contributing enough money to ensure that their names would be carved in some prominent place in the building. Numerius Septimius, who owned a lot of farmland, was the wealthiest man in the city. Not only did he contribute willingly to the new temple, but he paid for the entire construction of a new market. So that everyone would know of his generosity, he commissioned a marble statue of himself holding a bust of Ceres. It was carved in the workshop of Titus Statius, the best and largest stone-cutting shop in the city. When it was finished, it was transported by cart to the new market and erected near the fountain. Page 83. Diagram of stone-cutting workshop of Titus Statius. Page 84. As open land within the walls gradually disappeared, the importance of careful planning became more and more evident, especially in two well-thought-out ideas. The first was the street plan, which maintained order throughout, and the second was the setting aside of land for recreation and entertainment. Page 86. The public baths, called thermae, were not only for washing but also provided a place to meet, talk, exercise, gamble, and even read. Bathing was traditionally accomplished in 3 stages. First, the Romans washed in hot water from a pool in the steamy caldarium. Then they relaxed in a warm water pool in the tepidarium, and finally ended the process with a dive into the cold water pool of the frigidarium. Several small thermae were built during the reign of Augustus, but by AD 42 the population had reached 30,000, and the existing facilities were inadequate. The new Emperor Claudius ordered that a much larger thermae be built near the Forum on the site of the original baths. A professional demolition company was hired, and the old structure, along with a few apartment buildings, was torn down. Page 88. The mosaic-covered stone floors of the caldarium, tepidarium, and steam rooms were supported 2 feet off the ground by brick piers, creating a space below the floor called a hypocaust. Hot gases from a furnace outside the building were piped into the hypocaust to heat the rooms. When the hypocaust was full, the gas went up flues, clay pipes in the wall, heating the walls and out through the vents in the vaults. Suspended over the furnace were large bronze tanks in which water was heated for the baths. The hot water ran into the pool of the caldarium, and the overflow, cooling it as it went, was piped into the pool of the tepidarium. Page 90. Diagram of the entrance to the baths. Page 91. The caldarium, tepidarium, changing rooms, steam room, exercise room, snack bars, and toilets all had tunnel-vaulted ceilings. The larger area of the frigidarium was covered by a series of groin vaults, which are created when 2 tunnel vaults cross each other at a right angle. Each of the cold water pools in the frigidarium was covered by a dome ceiling with a round opening in the top called an oculus to let light in. During the construction of both the domes and the vaults, wooden shapes called coffers were fastened on top of the forms. When the concrete had set, the form and the coffer were lowered, leaving indentations in the surface of the ceiling which lightened but did not weaken it. This allowed the supporting walls or piers to be somewhat thinner. Page 92. Next to the thermae, a grassed area containing a swimming pool was enclosed by a 2-story colonnade. This area was called the palaestra, and was used for exercising and wrestling, among other things. Behind the second-floor colonnade and over the entrance a library was built, with a collection of scrolls for those who wished to read. To supply the increased amount of water needed for the larger baths and a growing population, a second aqueduct was constructed directly on top of the first. Page 94. The amphitheater. The last public area to be fully developed was the city's entertainment center. In AD 44, the Senate voted to build a more permanent amphitheater and theater. Until that time, a sloped earth mound lined with stone seats and reinforced by a ring of arches had enclosed both the arena and the stage of the theater. The original oval shape of the amphitheater was maintained and enlarged. The stone seats now rested on 2 layers of tunnel-vaulted passages radiating out from the center. These passages were connected by other passages which ran around the arena. Page 95. Diagram of the entrances and stairways and passageways of the amphitheater. Page 96. The arena was sunk several feet into the ground and surrounded by a high wall. Deep pools were built in the floor which could be filled for staging naval battles. When they weren't needed, they were covered by wooden boards and emptied through a canal into the cloaca. Besides toilets and a snack bar, the passages contained ramps and stairways which enabled the entire 20,000 spectators to enter or leave the structure in less than 10 minutes. Wild animals and equipment used in the performances were kept under the lowest seats in rooms which opened into the arena. The most popular performances involved the deaths of either animals, slaves, or gladiators, men paid to fight to kill each other. Page 98. The rows of arches, one on top of the other, formed the exterior wall of the amphitheater. This wall was constructed of carefully cut stones clamped together with iron and bronze pins. The passages and vaulting were all constructed of stone and concrete. If the sun was too hot, a canvas roof called a velarium were drawn over the seating area. When it rained during a performance, everyone took shelter in one of the passages. Page 100. During the construction of the amphitheater, some formwork was accidentally moved before the concrete in the vault had completely set, killing 25 slaves, their foreman, and a senator observing the work from the ground. The bodies of the slaves were taken on 2 carts to a field 4 miles outside of the city and buried in a large pit. The bodies of the senator and foreman were cremated and ashes sealed in urns. The senator's urn was placed in an elaborate family tomb, much closer to the city but still outside the walls as required by law. The foreman's urn was buried in a public but still respectable graveyard where his family erected a tombstone in his memory. Page 101. The Theater. Because the senator had always enjoyed plays, his family donated a large sum of money toward the construction of a new theater. The seats were built around a steep semicircular pit called a cavea. Like the seats of the amphitheater, they were supported by a network of concrete tunnels. A long wooden stage was constructed along the diameter of the cavea. At both sides of the stage, rooms were built for changing and storing costumes. A curtain could be raised from under the stage for scenery changes. Behind the stage, the wall, called the franz scene, was covered with marble columns and architectural ornamentation. This wall reached the same height as the colonnade that was built around the last row of seats in the caves. Sometimes the actors performed in the orchestra, the flat semicircular area directly in front of the stage. The most important people sat on wide seats around the orchestra or in balconies over the side entrances. The theater, too, could be covered by a velarium. By AD 75, both the amphitheater and theater were finished, and a festival which lasted 25 days was held to celebrate the occasion. Page 106. As Verbonia's population steadily climbed, most landlords replaced their small apartment buildings with large apartment blocks. Some, as high as 5 stories, contained 20 families. To take advantage of this height, which could still be no more than twice the width of the street, the Senate passed a law limiting the first apartment blocks to insulae along the northern and western sides of the city. In the winter, these buildings would shield the city from the cold wind that blew down the valley. As in earlier buildings, the apartments in each block were built around a light shaft. The lowest level of the buildings was a series of tunnel-vaulted rooms built side by side and opening onto the sidewalk. These spaces were rented by shopkeepers who constructed a wooden platform on which to live 8 feet above the floor. Stables and storerooms around the central courtyard were also rented out. Page 108. Diagram of a Roman insula. Page 109. By AD 100, Verbonia's population was almost 50,000. Many of the insula now contained up to 8 large apartment blocks, and only the wealthiest residents of the city could afford privately owned homes. As the demand increased, old therma, markets, and temples were torn down and replaced by larger, more adequate structures. The 2 aqueducts still satisfied the city's water needs, and the 120-year-old sewer system was still operating flawlessly. Because of the efficient organization of farmland and the large number of markets and bakeries, food continued to remain in good supply. The streets, although busy, were not overcrowded. They were still safe and comfortable outdoor areas, as originally intended in the master plan. 125 years after its founding, Verbonia had reached its limit. With the empire stronger than ever, the walls once constructed to keep the enemy out were now serving a more important function, that of keeping the city in. This is the end of City by David Macaulay.